This program is made possible by the Aleatoric Organization in association with the Divine Design. Greetings, invisible listeners, and welcome back to Self-Portraits as Other People, where we mindfully investigate where the limits of language meet the fringes of reality. I'm your host, the ungoogleable Michelangelo, and my guest today is Fishing in Space. The name of the episode is Microbial, Occultism.
The gods of this earth have always been and will always be mold and yeast and mycelium and lichen and archaea and bacteria and protozoa and amoeba and all what they call microorganisms are really beings, and these beings, they speak to us and they wear us, and they are the land itself. They sustain it, and they distribute resources. They bring fertility as well as deal disease. They bring magic and miracles. They bring mystery and mysticism. And they are carried through the wind and the sea, through rain and wood and soil and rock and flesh and bones.
As some of you might know, in 2023 I contracted a flesh-eating parasitic infection while living in the Mexican jungle. It's called leishmaniasis, and it took a bite out of my cheek and my hand. I dedicated an entire episode titled Leishmaniasis to this, and in consecutive episodes you could follow me on the healing journey. This is also around the time that I discovered Fishing in Space, which is the name that my guest goes by, and it's also the name of his YouTube channel where he houses his many video essays. I've been trying to get this guest on the show for a couple years now, and he's always been a bit reluctant. Maybe it was a moment of vulnerability when his TikTok page and his Instagram page were both simultaneously taken down that got him to agree to come on. I don't know. But it's his first time on a long-form conversation format, his first podcast appearance. And besides a little initial shyness, once we got the conversation going, he got his thoughts a-flowing, as I knew he would. The TikTok page, by the way, is back up and running. The Instagram, he had to start from scratch. We talked about matters of microanimism, the big smalls, and the folkloric mythic interface where the intersection of psychology and biology convene, converge, and converse. That's the sweet spot, where bacterial culture and human culture exchange recipes from the precipice. We both explore very similar territory, albeit in different ways and from different angles, so it was a treat to compare notes, so to speak. In preparation for the show, I grokked a bunch of his video essays, and he read my latest book, Lore Spores, Volume 1, Tales and Tools for Enhanced Enchantment, which is about the oracular nature of reality and the philosophical implications of pareidolia, a word you'll hear us say a bunch of times. Pareidolia, for those that don't know, is when you find meaningful patterns in random stimuli. Think faces in the clouds or Jesus on toast. He also read Paisley Ontology, which is a piece that I just published to my Patreon in preparation of this episode. And he also re-listened to the Self-Portraits as Other People episode titled Paradise Has Parasites. All of these things come up in the conversation, and they're all linked down in the show notes. I really appreciated that he took the time to delve deeper into my work just as I delved deeper into his. That kind of reciprocity is priceless. And if you don't want to be a tourist, I invite you to delve deeper as well and learn about the diverse ecology of ideas that we unearth on the episode. You can dig even deeper by joining my Patreon, which is now equipped with a Discord server as well, where the community may intermingle and create its own culture. That's also where you'll find a whole extra hour of my conversation with Fishing in Space. There's a small paywall, and you can always plunder the palace with a week-long free trial, so you really can't afford not to join. There's also plenty of free, idea-rich soil to till. A few things have changed since I last did this show. There's now also an option to see what we look like on YouTube. So if you're one of those people, you can watch a podcast. To each his own. Who am I to judge? Okay, enough preambling, rambling. Let's hear from Fishing in Space solo one more time, and then we're going to delve into the conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll meet you on the other side.
When I was a kid, I built an archangel. Not the Christian stuff, but from older animal religions. And now I can fly in a different universe. When I was a teenager, I learned how to dream. I learned how to meditate. I learned the mystic arts from all over the world. I learned what prophets know. I learned the secrets of kings. I learned the transmutation of alchemy. I learned of snake cults that predate religion, shamanic practices. Not because I follow anything in particular, but because I trained myself, taught myself, experienced them in my own way, without direction from anyone, so that I could construct my own path, forge my own weapons. I learned how to navigate, how to wayfind, to listen to the land and to talk to it too. I learned how to shape clouds, how to move them, how to make them disappear, how to make the rain fall. We are old forms, and we must learn new skills, and forge those skills into swords, and wield those swords like scythes. I don't believe in the human race or civilization. They are built off of rape and slavery of the land and of people. Years ago, I branded myself a permanent scar into my skin, a vow that I would destroy civilization. But my ultimate goal lies far beyond their downfall. You need to learn how to weaponize all of your skills, all of your talents. It's meaningless if you don't, because the sword is life, and all of the dreams are slipping away. We don't fight for it. There are enemies and there are wars. And if you sit and do nothing, you'll have nothing left. I have learned from the old ways of the entire world, not because I'm religious or interested in cults, but because they are weapons. They are ways of war. They are victory. They are the lineage and the heritage of all of us. Of the land and the sea and the air, and stone and wood and bone, and those ways which are lost but will return. And the kind of magic that I have, the world has never seen before. The ghost lights, the shadow flame, the kind that doesn't burn with physical substrate, but which enters into your hearts, into your minds, and ignites that fire of dreams, that light inside, that makes your dreams glow. And I'll never stop until I'm either dead or have destroyed civilization. But even if I die, the mycelium of what I share, of that shadow fire that I spread, will exist way beyond me, as it snakes its way into everyone who interacts with my information, with my shade, because you can't unsee what I show you. And every day you see things, and you'll think of the way and the information, the morphology of ideas that have changed in you, and they'll continue to evolve. Not because I'm spreading anything in particular, anything specific, but I'm spreading how you can hold that fire within you, how it becomes transformed by you, your own signature. Everything I share is non-specific, but it's at the very heart, the very root of your being, and your place in the world and your connection to the land, the stars and the galaxy in your eyes, where you come from, where you're going, and what you're going to fight for. The archangel that I built as a kid is strong and will only ever get stronger. I offer a force of truth, but I'll burn it down in dragon flame if it means we can have freedom from tyranny and of empires and of civilization. There are more than just humans on this earth. Every spider, every raven, every wolf, every beetle, every rock and stone and river, they carry that ghost light. And they'll always be there, reminding you. You humans live strange lives in deep trance, mesmerized by inadequacy, weakness, cowardice. Civilization is built from rape. You don't know what everyone's waiting for. What occasion are you waiting for? The only heroes in the world are you and I.
Great. Fishing in space. So good to have you here in person virtually.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, this is really exciting, man. I've been going through kind of a phase of what I call manic repression, where I just been kind of just subdued, and from the inside of my walls I can feel myself pounding to start different things again, including starting the podcast up, but then there's been all these barriers in there. And I just haven't felt, even though I'm in New York, I haven't felt very intellectually stimulated in a while. So you agreeing to come onto the show feels like we're kind of jump starting it in proper fashion to get into all the things that I'm really interested in with somebody that's very interesting and interested in these things as well. So this is
thank you.
It's an honor.
I'm excited
and
too.
A privilege. Yeah, I discovered your work a few years ago. I think on TikTok you started showing up on my feed, and it was right around the time that I was dealing with leishmania, which is my little parasitic flesh-eating protozoan friend that burrowed into my cheek.
Yeah.
It's healed up quite nicely. You probably can't even see it on the camera, and the one on my hand too has left a nice scar, my battle scar from where I vanquished them. And so your work showing up on there and talking about microbial realities in a very kind of mythic, fable-rich way was really resonated with me. And I think one of the first things that I saw of yours was the video you made about Halloween, essentially, about hauntology and the kind of origins. You struck through the mask of the myth, which is something I don't see people do very often, because for the most part, people tend to dwell in the appearances and they really get hung up on these kind of ideal forms and archetypes, but you kind of struck through that and you pointed out the way that a lot of these kind of icons and archetypes of the witch and the vampire and all this kind of stuff ties into these microbial realities. So maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe you can riff on that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm freezing up a bit.
No, that's all right, man. Just breathe your way.
First time I've ever done something like this.
Breathe your way through it. It's I know you have it in you.
Well, I guess just to get straight into what you do, which is a lot of pareidolia, because I think it ties into why some of these sort of microbial themes are going to be expressed through these motifs and archetypes of kind of folk creatures and cryptids and mythological beings, whether it's gods or spirits or anything like that, because microorganisms are going to, in some sense, they have to work through your imagination, which is just how your brain's processing everything. Because we aren't microscopes. We don't have like that view of them. And so I think there's a syncretism there between what we both do, which is, I guess, just looking at what we can't see and somehow trying to see what isn't there.
Right. There's this I mean, I'll talk about the unconscious, or like the realm is kind of like the term that I've given this kind of imaginative void that when we interface with it tends to like spring into what I call lore, which is kind of the realm which is unspeakable and unquantifiable, which then finds form or folk form even, like these kinds of things. And then over time, we kind of lose touch with what it symbolizes. But it makes sense that something that, like microbial realities, microorganisms, which is such an alien dimension, really, but it's also a spiritual dimension. And this is, I think, where your work, like myself, I think you're a storyteller and a kind of poet-philosopher who casts a kind of spell onto the web to enliven these realities in people and make them aware of it. Because when you gaze into that void gazes back and almost it becomes personified in a way, right? Like maybe you can touch on to some of those things from the hauntology. Like I remember you were talking about, for instance, like high frequencies, like the bells in a church or something like that, or the frankincense, or the way the light that vanquishes vampires, how that ties into, for instance, or garlic, things like that.
Right. So that's one thing I noticed was that I was learning about like folklore, history, mythology, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, I was learning about microorganisms. And what I kept finding was all of these like naturally antimicrobial properties to different incenses or different herbs and spices, or even sunlight itself, high frequency noises. They're always associated with like banishing evil spirits or cleansing or working against such and such demonic entity or what have you. And it just kept coinciding with very real practical applications of material substances like garlic being anti-parasitic and being something that drives away evil spirits. And so they just kept lining up. And then I don't know if that means that microbes are explaining away the spiritual dimension. I don't think so. I think that there's something inherently spiritual about microorganisms, but where the two overlap, or which is an expression or manifestation of the other, is probably anyone's game.
Yeah, I think of this guy David Abram, who wrote a book that I love that you'd probably really enjoy as well, called Spell of the Sensuous, where he was a stage magician, he used to go to Alice's restaurant, like the one that I think Arlo Guthrie or the other Guthrie sang about, and he would do tricks at people's tables, and then what it would do is it would kind of cast the spell of the sensuous on them. It would kind of baffle their minds and get them out of their heads to a sense of wonderment where they didn't know what was going on. They had to come to terms with the fact that some kind of sleight of hand was happening, but they didn't know how. And so there was this kind of like suspension of disbelief. And then when they would step outside, the sky would be brighter, everything would be more enlivened. And in the beginning of this book, he talks about his time in Bali, where he was kind of studying with various magicians and studying their ways and their trickster qualities. And he noticed that people there would leave out little plates of food as offerings for the spirits. And then he noticed that the spirit foods would disappear. So he'd be like, wait, what's going on here? And he would watch and study this, and he'd notice that it was ants that would come to the border of where these little plates were placed, and they would take the food and they would carry it off. And so he started thinking about the world of spirit and spirituality not as these kinds of like abstract confabulations like we usually do, but rather as the non-human world. And so in that sense, I think that these microbiological realities are exactly that. And when I think of the occult just means hidden, you know? It means unseen, invisible. And like, what is more hidden and invisible than microorganisms? Unless you have, like you said, like you have a microscope. And yet these things build and sustain this world, and they heal this world, and they destroy this world. They break down matter. They build up matter. And I think that nowadays there's so much... There seems to be, at least in the circles that I listen to, there seems to be this clash, this battle between this kind of like idealism, which is ultimately like spirits as immaterial form, or archetypes as beings in some repository or something like that, and materialism in the sense of like reductive materialism, like billiard balls of atoms like clashing into each other. But I've termed this thing, I call it meta-realism, which is a sort of like materialist expansionism, which I think is exactly the realm you operate in, is that the material itself is, our perception of it is so reduced. Like even when we talk about the body, you know, as if it's one object, when it's all these different processes working together. And not just that, it's all these beings holding it together and working together, you know? And we just want to like dissociate from that and think we are this one solid self that's, you know, running the show, when in actuality we don't even know how to digest food or respirate or beat our hearts. All this stuff is regulated largely by all these spiritual processes, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, when you were talking about the magician and his storytelling, that I think goes back to the whole oral tradition, the whole storytelling tradition, which in large part was these sort of shamanic people who would go into these, I think you call it the realm or the interiority complex. They would go into the abyss, essentially, perhaps this microscopic realm, in order to find problems, to figure out solutions, look for answers. And when they would come out of it, they would tell these stories. And these stories are how you get these myths and fantasies and religions, ultimately. What we call myths and fantasies, but everything is, to some extent, just the story that is told of it. And the ones we maybe don't think are real enough, we call fantasy. But there's something inherent to the way in which you have to tell stories, the way in which you have to use the imagination in order to define what's going on in these unseen, hidden realms. And then that being something that is a sensory experience that's like lights up your whole world. That's why you leave like a play or some really nice story and everything is brighter. You're seeing things you never saw before. And so that's the power of stories, of language.
Yeah, it's like a feng shuiing of perspective that can happen, you know? And I like the origins of shamanism. I was just reading back this piece that I published on my Patreon. It's a public post. I'll link it in the show notes. That was about shamanism versus showmanism. And it kind of gets into how the roots of theater, for instance, or the roots of like the rock star archetype, like David Bowie, Prince, you know, Jim Morrison, came from that original shamanic tradition where the shaman was a kind of like a kind of actor who had these different skill sets where they would like be able to do ventriloquism, like throw their voice or make animal sounds and things like that. And then in the dark ceremonial container, they would basically stage a journey into the underworld. And then the patients or the clients would vicariously journey along. And that's, I think, what you're describing is like that storytelling is a way to induce people into that spell of the sensuous or into that realm. I wanted to make one distinction between myth and fantasy. This is an insight I had a long time ago, was that myth always tends to analog something, you know? I think there's these ideas that, for instance, the idea of the resurrection of Christ, that it's about yeast, that it's about like rising again and this kind of thing. There's always an analog, but when the myth strays from what it is trying to symbolize, that's when you get into the realm of fantasy. It's kind of like where it stands alone. And I think of the second Matrix movie, where now they're in Zion, but Zion is a fucking soap opera. It's just like another, like all the revolution and all the magic is gone, and they're just having like domestic quibbles amongst themselves.
Right. That is a good distinction between myth and fantasy.
And I think also folklore fits into that as well, which folklore I think is very specific also to place. It has to do with like the particular genius loci, the particular resonant spirits of a place, and it has to do with the materials of that place and the ecosystem and the way that kind of cusps over into this particular story form.
Exactly, and that's why there's a limitation to taxonomy, I think, in that it's not like every tree that's a magnolia is the same magnolia all across the entire world. Your magnolia in your town could have these attributes and qualities to it. It's become its own kind of folk legend around it. And so within all of biology, we have such categorized fields, and that kind of predetermines something's abilities and what it can be or can't be. And especially when you get down to microorganisms, it's even shadier territory to do that, because they're in the hundreds of trillions and they're working together in ways that we don't comprehend. They create these communities and things affect them that we simply aren't, certainly in science, aren't ready to accept.
Right. I mean, science has its hubris, of course, that keeps it from seeing that the seer is influencing the scene, and that like you're saying, like the language that we attach to these things in a way limits our perception of these things. Like a good example was this Dutch, I think it's called an etologist, right? Somebody that studies animals. This Dutch etologist, Frans de Waal, who wrote a book called Are Animals as smart as we think they are, or something like that? I always like to say, are animals smarter than as smart as we think we are, or something like that.
Is that the book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I did read that one.
So remember when he talks about this test they made about elephants and trying to test their intelligence and see if they can open this box, and they used their trunk to open it, but they didn't take into account that the trunk is not just a grasping tool, it's also their nose. And so the whole test was set up in a way that was like set up for failure, until we realized that it was our failure of apprehending that. And you had a video I watched the other day about, which was one of your more humorous videos I found, was about a particular bug that's called a junk bug.
Oh,
if you want to talk about that for a second.
So the junk bug is just some predatory little thing that likes to hunt other bugs, and it attaches those carcasses onto its body until it builds this sort of like debris body camouflage. And the fact that we call it a junk bug is such a disservice to what it would be like to be a bug, and you're encountering this thing that's just an amalgamation of the bodies of its slain enemies. And biology just has no creativity.
Yeah, and the junk that it carries are like also living organisms like lichen and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So if we saw that in our scale of things, that would be terrifying.
Yeah, that'd be a serial killer right there. That's like Ed Gein or something, like dressed up in the skins of it, or making lampshades out of the skins of his victims. Yeah, it's funny how we do that. How we ultimately like. I mean, it's also it's the way that we have to reason, I guess. We have to like limit things by, like ascribing observation to it. But again, just like the way people get stuck in the appearances of myths rather than striking through it and figuring out what it's about, we also get stuck in our apprehensions of our understandings. And there's a Julian Jaynes, who is like a big influence on me. One thing I like to quote from his book is that when he breaks down what understanding is, that understanding is really just the feeling of familiarity. And in order to understand something, we supplant it with something that we understand better. And a lot of times that's words, that's metaphor, is the supplanting of one thing for another. And so there was a time, for instance, that we thought of the heart as a kettle. And then when somebody was like having a fever and they're overheating, they're like, oh, you gotta let off steam. So they came up with bloodletting, and then like people would just die. Like the metaphor isn't always a 1-to-1 kind of ratio. There's these divergences. So if we're not aware of that, and if we eat paper currency, like instead of realizing that it's a medium, an interface between realm and lore, then, we fall victim to our own traps, essentially.
Right. Actually, on the subject of fevers, what's interesting is that it's not your body temperature that's killing the infection, because your body temperature gets to maybe 105 on the high end, which is dangerous territory for you. But to most microorganisms, they're going to live up to 160, maybe 200 degrees prolonged. So the fever is a state where your body's producing a ton of ultraviolet light. And that ultraviolet light is at a wavelength that can penetrate the cell of infecting microbes and destroy them from the inside, just like sunlight, essentially. It's the same wavelength that the sun can give off. And so the body temperature comes from your whole body's kind of like generating this ultraviolet light with shivers, with just chemical reactions, with electrical reactions. And then it cleanses you essentially from the infection if you let the fever continue. What we often do is take fever reducers and then just try to do antibiotics.
Right. The fever reducers, I think, are also kind of just help us brave through that process of generating ultraviolet light. But is that ultraviolet light, is that biophotons?
Yes, that would be biophotons, which is just a biological process of producing photons.
And that happens in the brain, or where does that occur?
It's going to happen pretty much your whole body.
Like every cell has kind of like a core of light. That's kind of like photosynthetic, I guess, huh? Or like the bacteria generated to keep it going.
Yeah, so there's a few different processes. You can actually produce it mechanically. So whenever you're moving muscles, there's mechanical biophotons that are being created. There's also pressure photons. So you can, if you press on yourself, there's light that is emitted. Obviously, in the wavelength we can't see on a level that we can't detect. But that's also why you can use an infrared camera and see someone. We give off infrared light. We give off ultraviolet light. And these have different qualities to them. They do different things in the body. It's not just a byproduct, but it's very integral to every working system within the body. For example, the reason why you can dream at night is because you have light inside of your brain. And you can also, if you close your eyes and press on them, you get that pressure light. That's a phosphine. That's biophotons. And with REM sleep, your eyes are going back and forth. And if you do that and close your eyes, you're going to see this mechanical activation of light. And that's going to help feed the visuals of a dream, of why you can see a dream even though there's no light.
Right. That's something I think about a lot, is that the seeing of the third eye, quote unquote third eye, is a metaphorical seeing. But then I learned through you about these phosphines, and that made a lot of sense to me, because as like kind of a visionary explorer, that quality of that light and the way that as a kind of ink blot interfaces with, the pareidolik generation. And then, like on an amplifier, on a kind of like dissociating amplifier that turns you further inward, allows you to kind of like run with that light and allow it to take on its various forms. So that's very interesting to me.
And on the subject of fevers, the meditative trance sort of state is essentially a fever that you're kind of manually entering, even though there's no infection. So the same mechanism that starts a fever, which is you're generating all of this light, this heightened electrical state, that's what a like meditative, I don't know if you want to call it like transcendent meditation, whatever. That's the same state you're doing. You're increasing all of this electrical activity, and you also happen to be focusing on like your visual system or maybe some kind of thought. So that is all being driven to certain regions of your brain that are activated when you think of those things. And that's going to cause such an overload of sensation that you start to get into that kind of like the abyss. You start to get into these different realms, these
Fever
different
dream kind of territory.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember when I was a kid, I had a fever. When I was a child, I had a fever, to quote Pink Floyd, and really like that kind of like hands like balloons kind of feeling. But I was laying in my mother's bed, and in the dark, it was almost like this raft on this ocean. And then I remember these like these cages were placed around the bed that lit up like this pure fever dream, crystalline hallucinatory reality. And in these metal cages, there were these reindeer essentially that were just like bleating beyond despair. And so I'm just like tossing and turning in this thing, like what is this? And then I remember these bright lights like hitting me and coming towards me, like this truck or something that was like hitting towards me, which was, unforgettable memories of childhood.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what you're describing, is that kind of thing. And it also makes me think of Stuart Davis, who was a guest of mine on one of my earlier episodes, who one day, I think it was on New Year's, he had a high fever and he decided to meditate while in a fever, so kind of doubling down on that mechanism. And he was visited by a 9-foot tall mantis entity that stood at the foot of his bed, and through what he described as like clicks and sounds transmitted this telepathic message to him that then flared up in his mind as a full film. He saw this full film, like from beginning to end, and he ended up writing this script and then meeting the girl that he envisioned was in that film at some point, and kept having all these mantis synchronicities, and did a really great, we explored this in the podcast episode, but he did a great like standalone hour-long kind of audio documentary called Man Meets Mantis, where he gets into all this really far-out stuff. But yeah, that seems to track the fever meditation kind of state. That's very interesting as well.
And I think especially that kind of like visitation or experience of some sort of entity type thing, I think that's kind of inherent to a lot of the shamanic traditions, that they would do that. So they would do is if someone like in the community was sick, they would basically do everything that person did and kind of wear their skin. They would try to pull that infection into themselves, because then they were going to go in and meditate and have these visual experiences, maybe try out different entheogens or different herbs to see what works. And they're going to learn not only like how to cure it, but they're going to learn why this happened. What kind of like spirit, what kind of injunction was broken? Why did this person get sick? What does it mean? What is there to learn from it? And then how do you kind of like come to terms and make peace with the sort of infecting agent? How do you offer it back to repair it and heal it and kind of be one with the land again?
That's fascinating. So they would basically take on some of the sickness, like a sample of the sickness, in order to study it within their own kind of advanced mental state.
Yeah, and these shamans, they were some of the most fit people, not just physically fit, but like mental endurance and the ability to take on just random infections and preparing yourself to deal with it, which it could be something that you can't even really beat. They could have it for the rest of their life. So they were very extreme regimens of fitness and health, and they were kind of isolated because it's a very hard thing. It's a very difficult path to do. But let's see. Have you heard the book Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings?
Absolutely. I actually have a few quotes pulled up from it that I wanted to
Perfect.
bring up at some point. But it also, what you're saying, it reminds me of the Iceman Wim Hof. I remember when I first saw that Vice documentary about him, for those that I think everybody by now knows who Wim Hof is, but he was a guy that was basically driven by extreme circumstances, his wife's suicide, to, find healing or find a teacher, and then he ended up, I think, walking barefoot in his underwear up Mount Everest or something like that, and the cold became his teacher, and he's basically, science has studied this, he's managed to have control over his nervous system to the point where he can heat it up, cool it down, expel disease, so you can be happy, healthy, and strong, it says. And I remember in that documentary, there's a moment where he leads a group of people on a journey into the mountains, into the cold. And there's a moment where he's kind of ahead of everybody and everybody else is kind of like following along, and he stops and he looks back, and the look in his eye, I was like, this guy's a fucking shaman. Like, he's like, I have survived this, and if you believe in yourself, you can too. But there was also this kind of like softness in his eyes of like, he could be wrong too, like some people might not survive it. And after watching that documentary, I had an ayahuasca ceremony, and that moment stood out to me, and it clicked in my head. And I remember there was like a breeze that came into the room, even though it was a closed room. There was this breeze coming along, and my body started kind of like heating up. And I remember feeling like I was overheating. I was like, oh, fuck, man, am I going to die? Like, what did I do? Like, maybe I wasn't healthy enough to take ayahuasca right now. Like, what's going on? And my body was just like heating up, and I was catching these kind of like little fiery little demons that I thought of like little adrenal demons or something like that were like coming through. And then this breeze came into the room, even though it was a closed room, and just kind of like cooled me back down. So maybe that was also my body just like heating up and expelling whatever like weakness or sickness was in there. But I kind of like hijacked there because you were about to get into something about, what his name, Carlos Herrera, that wrote that book? I learned about it through you, by the way. Caesar.
Oh,
Herrera.
Caesar Herrera, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't know that about Iceman. I didn't know that was his story. But that is very similar to what I've read in a lot of different shamanic traditions. Obviously, that being like a basket term. I know they're not usually referred to shamans within those cultures, but...
Yeah, I was curious, too, about what you described earlier, those shamans, from what tradition that stemmed, if you remember that.
They specifically talked about it in the Amerindian shamanism, but I've read it similar approaches in various from Asia, Africa, and so on. But because one of the things they did, which is similar to what you just described in the documentary, was they would, as like a prerequisite before they could become this kind of healer role, they would have to do a test like that would involve them being able to completely master their nervous system. And so you might have the ant test, which is they would lay on the ground. I think this might have been Eskimo specifically, but they would like lay on the ground for potentially days at a time over an ant nest and let their bodies get just completely eaten alive while they're going to maintain this sort of meditative trance. And they're going to learn how to like basically get taken apart by nature and put themselves back together. But there's other kind of tests
in a physical way, or like because I know there's like the imaginal, dismemberment. But is this in like a physical way that they would just like let the creatures gnaw away at them?
They would physically let them eat them while I think they're in that mental space of like, how do you control the healing process? How do you like transform the pain and understand what this insect's doing? They would do the worm test too, which would just be other insects biting them, or they would be in the cold and starve for several days.
It's like ritual traumatization in a way to induce dissociation from the body in order to, because this is the mechanism of dissociation, right? Is that trauma is something that's, if you would confront it directly, it would basically just destroy you because your personality can't categorize or integrate it, so you would dissociate, and then that dissociation creates a kind of dissociative flight or visionary state through which the trauma will often through dreams and visions create these kinds of archetypal defense systems, these guardians and ambassadors of the trauma that are coming at you with kind of the aura of that wound but in a way that is seeking to heal it, but could also easily re-traumatize, you know? So it's
Right.
that's kind of the tricky thing about the shamanic territory, is it's such a double-edged blade in that regard.
And on the note of dissociation, how it works, like neurologically, I guess you could say, and why it's like inherently a visionary experience is because in order to dissociate, you have these powerful optic nerves that are going to go through your brain into your thalamus, and your thalamus is your relay center. And there's other signals that compete for access to get conscious attention.
Can you
And
explain
so
relay
you're-
center? What you
The
mean? by that?
thalamus.
But what does that mean, relay?
Oh, so that means the thalamus is going to say, okay, this signal is going to go over here to the visual cortex.
Gotcha. It's
Or
the
this
operator
sense is
that's
gonna
kind
be-
of plugging in the control board. Yeah. Switchboard.
Yeah, exactly. So your priority is vision has priority over like sensations in your body. And so that's dissociation when your visual signals, they dampen any other signal in your body, including pain signals. So that's usually why dissociation will happen, is there's some level of pain or trauma happening to you in order to not feel that so you can survive. Because if you're feeling all the like trauma hitting you, it could stop your heart. That kind of stuff can be enough to actually destroy your body. So this is a survival, like evolutionary survival mechanism in order to flood the nervous system, the central nervous system, with visual signals. And that is inherently going to start giving you like those trippy entoptic, that interiority realm things. So that's why they're so related to like you survive this trauma and now you have this like ability to see things
Second
differently.
sight, kind of, yeah.
Yep.
That's another term, entoptic. That's something that I learned through you. Entoptic vision is basically the eye seeing itself. And I remember early in my psychonautical explorations, I had that insight of like, all I'll ever see are my own eyes, just miniature worlds painted in light on my eyeballs that are then processed in the brain and simultaneously projected outwards with my own associations worked in. I remember looking at the clouds and seeing all these incredible shapes and saying like, how considerate of them to work that into this, to work my associations into the design, you know? But entoptic vision is something that we'll probably touch on to a lot here, but I just wanted to clarify that for the listeners if they hadn't heard that term before.
Yeah. So entoptic is not only just seeing in your eye, which is like floaters. That's an entoptic view. You can also see
which are just collagen clusters, right? They're not actually organisms, from what I understand. I just did that drawing of them, and then I had to like do a little research. And I'm like, what are they again? But they're like little collagen clusters that are just, you're actually just seeing the shadow of them.
Yes. Yeah. They could be blood cells. If there's a rampant infection, it's probably true that it could be actual microorganisms. But there's actually a way you can see microorganisms with entoptic vision, but that's not generally what floaters are. But entoptic is not only just structures within the eye. It can be anything in the nervous system can be an entoptic vision because like we said, the nervous system has light in it. That light can be rebound and sent to the visual cortex. So you can see structures in your nervous system in your visual cortex, and it's going to look like it's coming from your eye when it's just because you can take any part of your brain and it can send those signals and they can connect to the visual cortex, and then you can see them.
Yeah, that's really interesting territory. I think of like, I had an eye exam a couple years ago during my like leishmanial saga, and they put these drops in my eyes that they said like, it's going to blur your eyes for like the next hour or so, but because it's going to dilate your pupils and you might see some like shapes. And I would remember seeing like these branching nerve forms, which were literally like my blood vessels or my optic nerves or something, which then became like visual. And I had a DMT experience in the desert once where also I was watching, and I did a rendering of this, watching these kind of like nerves coming in, which I interpreted them as dendrites, you know, because I was in a kind of like manic repression, which is really just saying like a depressed state. And it was kind of like firing off all these neurons in order to kind of clear the channels and rewire this kind of thing. But you've taken this into some really interesting territories, and have done some very rigorous work on this, I feel, when you talked about like the entoptic temple, for instance, which is kind of breaks this down into 4 different categories. And then you also talked about how these shapes of the nervous system being sent to the eye, basically to the visual centers, are kind of like a much more grounded take on archetypes or archetypal forms that you keep seeing in all these different world traditions and in cave art and things like that. How like these iconic images are imprinted because it's literally the eyes are sending these signals, which then probably get caught in the textures of rocks and become this kind of like pareidolik tracing. And then there are various interpretations of that through world traditions or different variations on those themes. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, let me just use you as an example, because maybe this will help make sense of things. Because you have that like pareidolia brain, which would basically probably mean that you have this like constellation of neural connections that see things that created this sense of pareidolia. And if we actually want to talk about it, we probably need to go back to babies. So every baby is actually synesthetic. And I guess on a side note, I think that animism is actually not like a belief so much as it's like an experience. And I think it has to do with like synesthesia, which allows you to kind of
cross-wire the senses, basically, like seeing
sounds,
sounds,
enough to where it starts to become almost divinatory, which again is going to relate back to your pareidolia. But so when you're first born, your brain is mostly gray matter, which is like wild, open country territory. These connections can go anywhere to anywhere. And by the time you hit age 8, your body starts to prune back unused connections. And for most people, because we relate senses one-to-one, like eye to vision, ear to hearing, we prune back all these other potential connections. And that happens we start to put myelin, which is white matter. This is like a fatty tissue that surrounds the nerves that allows for like high speed processing, which at the same time narrows what it's allowed to connect to. So the more white matter,
kind of what they call the default mode network, right? This kind of like reducing valve, as Huxley put it.
Right. So as you're conditioning that default mode network, you're losing out on some of these other sensory experiences that you could potentially have. So I think for you with pareidolia, you had that as a kid, right? And then because you continued to use it, you continued to like grow it. You continue to cultivate it. And over time, that's going to start connecting to more and more different processing centers in your brain. So more than just visual signals, but now you're getting it in different kinds of senses of like the essence of things. You're starting to see scenes play out in blotches of color. And I think that that starts to somehow become kind of archetypal. That starts to become that like folkloric understanding of like the quality or the lifeness to the so-called inanimate.
Well, it's a kind of an anthropomorphization of it as well, you know? Like, I don't know, did you get to revisit my Paradise Has Parasites episode by any chance?
Yes, I did.
Because listening back to it myself, I was like, oh man, this is a really good illustration of the various layers through which this very inhuman world, this alien world, kind of like becomes more and more human. So I'll link it in the show notes, but in this story I talk about an ayahuasca experience where all of a sudden it was like, whoop, suddenly I was like face to face with this like groggy, like parasitic being that was almost like this, like had this one like black beady lidless eye, and it was just like oh, it was just so nasty and dark. And I was like, oh, fuck, this thing is living inside me. This thing is feeding off of me. And then as I was negotiating, it was holding me hostage. As I was negotiating its evacuation, it became more and more like anthropomorphized and feeding on this this attention. And so at one point it was like, I'm gonna come out your mouth, roll out the red carpet of your tongue, and I'm gonna come walk out. And I saw it like strutting down the catwalk and just like waving at the paparazzi with the flash bulbs. And then it didn't come out. I was just hunched over the purge bucket waiting to vomit, and it didn't come out. And I was like, what's going on? Like, what are we doing? And as like the longer it went on, the more and more it began to like personify and basically feed me the production design to realize it. It was like, I described it as like a caterpillar made of these like metal coils with like purple crepe paper and light coming from inside. And then it had Danny DeVito's face. And, you know, it kept going and going and feeding on this kind of like personification, this attention, which I think that's kind of the what I consider human nature is basically like a reflection of the entire natural world. So our nature mimics all the nature of forms in nature. And so some of these forms which do not have personification, which is to say personas through sound, they don't have a voice. They want their story told. They want to be acknowledged in lore because it's like, hey man, we're building this whole, we're the union, you know, we're the workers. We built this whole thing. We sustain it. We can break it down. Give us our flowers, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And one more thing, just to circle back to the baby and the synesthesia, it reminds me of Terence McKenna described how when a child is like laying in its crib and then this being flies into the room and it's this like beautiful iridescence and you know, he's describing this like splendor, this transcendental splendor, and then the mother walks into the room and she goes, "That's a bird," and the whole thing just collapses into this word, you know, and suddenly like all the splendor, all the marvel, all the wonder is gone, and it's now whoop, it's a bird. And this guy David Abrams, Spell of the Sensuous, actually points out that what abstracted the senses, or what ruptured us from the sensual world, is language, which is itself synesthetic, at least written language. Because when you think about it, it's visual markings on a page that register as words in our cranial echo chamber, unless you're like anaudial or whatever they call it, you know, where you don't have an imagination of sound. But that's a whole nother topic that I think we can leave on the table for now.
Yeah. And on the subject of written language, as far as I've been able to come to the understanding of, it's also coming from entoptic images. Because if you look at the like mythological origins of language, it's always coming from like this king, whatever culture you want to talk about. King Scorpion in Egypt, I believe it was Enmerkar from Sumeria, and so on. It's like these are the legendary like inventors of language, written language. Now, obviously, they didn't come up with it, or wouldn't have come up with it, out of thin air, because they're pulling from long histories of divinatory languages. So these like sacred kings, they were initiated or immersed in a lot of the shamanic traditions of whatever culture we're talking about. And so they had that mystical shamanic side to them, as well as they were statescraft and maybe warriors. They were dealing with like day-to-day the harmony of the land and people. And so they took that divinatory language and they started to make it into something that you could use to record information, to dispense laws, and to codify the society that they lived in.
Right. And you, in one of your videos, you show kind of these pictograms and how certain hieroglyphics or iconic motifs then evolve into basically like the Roman alphabet, or what is it? Is it Roman? Whatever our alphabet is, which is interesting. I learned. I was introduced to ayahuasca through somebody who was kind of like a chakra scholar, and he had made this instructional video about the Amha Bija meditation, which is a kind of like seed syllable meditation where you chant the Sanskrit alphabet, and that sound vibration corresponds to different nadis or petals of the chakras, like different nodes of the energy centers in your body in order to activate it. And he proposed in that actually the Sanskrit alphabet comes from this like luminous portal of the chakras. Like he hypothesized that when you see this mandala in your visions, that's actually like a bird's eye view into the grail-like structure of the chakras of your intrinsic light body, which is kind of, like you're saying, like the biophotonic energy structure within you. And that each of these petals had this seed syllable that they pulled out, even though that's more akin to like where the sonic language came from, because there's two kinds of language, right? There's the animal language like we're doing now, where there's like sound vibrations and tonality and intentionality that rides on it, and then there's basically dead thought, which gets revived as we read it aloud. But it's those markings, and I think those markings you're proposing are evolved from entoptic languages, which I can relate to, because like in a lot of my pareidolik divinations, there are these little markings that I find in the texture that I've really come to embrace, because I love the fluidity of having learned. I still remember very vividly learning cursive, and you have like all the little F's, F lines, like setting those hand movements free into this kind of like entoptic visionary language is really satisfying, and I think speaks a kind of language of the body, or like you're saying, like of the nervous system, akin to the patterns that termites gnaw into tree bark, or the sinewy calligraphy of rivers and that sort of thing.
Right. As a specific example, Chinese script came from the I Ching, but the I Ching came from oracle bone script, which is their shamanic practice of reading turtle shells, cracks in turtle shells as a form of divination, and that would evolve into their script, their actual written language today.
That's so interesting. See, it's I feel like a lot of these kind of new age, or even like new age, that like denounce the new age and think that they're onto this new ideal kind of mindset, are just like they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, meaning to say they're throwing out biology and physiology, and they're sticking to this kind of like psychological template, but it's really the psychophysiology is what's interesting to me, is that this notion that all these mental constructs are based on physical constructs, which is basically how Julian Jaynes speaks about consciousness, not in the sense that consciousness is talked about now, but as this subjective interiority that's basically mind space is metaphor-generated space based on, as we learned language, which basically was like, very simple at first. It was like, rock, stick, like things that are in the physical behavioral world. And then as that becomes more complex and abstract, it creates basically an analog of the physical world in what I call the department of the interior, this kind of like this mind space in which also you is an analog I and a metaphor me. And that's what most of us identify with, is this metaphor of you, but you are actually this action figure that's made up of this consortium of beings that are all pulling strings like invisible stage hands to keep the show running. But we think we're the showrunners, like we have, and it's funny because we don't formally exist. And I think all of civilization is kind of set up as an effort, the ego's effort to stop time, to stop change, to come to a conclusion, and is set up to prop up this sense of individualism rather than realizing that we are part of something far stranger, and we're just like these hallucinatory beings riding the cusp. And in my humble opinion, I think that I don't think that the personality that is Michelangelo is going to survive this. You know what I mean? Like, this is what we always think, like life after death, or like
Mm-hmm.
survival of consciousness after death. It's like, well, when I think this will cease to be, which is why I'm trying to print out as much as I can of what I learn along the way in order to create an infrastructure for future generations to be able to navigate their way through the flesh. But I think at the moment of death, the life after death is exactly these microbial realities that have imprinted information from the life that I've lived, that'll break down the body and that'll continue to carry on, just as, you know, our ancestors are, you know, deep cellular ancestors that live inside the body, not just inside the body. That is what the body is.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we come from the land, and that's where we're gonna go when we're done.
And
But actually,
and the air, right? And the air.
yeah, the air, like, yeah, the whole sphere. But this was just processing while you were telling me with the you're mentioning the chakras and the Sanskrit kind of vibrations and stuff. Within entoptic phenomena, you can have like your brain tuned to whatever rhythm you're doing. Maybe it's like shamanic drumming, or maybe it's that like humming, or the language of Sanskrit or any other musical language. And you get into that trance, your brain starts to synchronize with that. And so you get these kind of like, you can get these Chladni plate entoptic images of your brain's neurons being synchronized to that shape. And then because you're in a visual experience, you can then pull those out, and then you can see those elaborate geometric mandala-like patterns.
And those are kind of ideal forms. And a Chladni plate, for those that don't know, is a vibrating plate that you put salt or sand on, and then the vibrations conform it into kind of mandalas and geometries and things like that. When I think of, what's the guy's name? Masaru Emoto, the water chemical guy who did these experiments where vibrations would change the molecular structure of the water, which I think people, again, get hung up on the words. They're like, I'm going to write love on my water bottle, and that's going to do it. Like, I think it's a vibrational thing more than like I think the scribble of the pen is more going to influence the structure than the word on the bottle. But what he pointed out is like, you know, that like things that are charged with negative emotion would create kind of like asymmetry, which is also in Shipibo shamanism. If you look at the kane, which are the kind of circuitous motherboard metaphors in their tapestries, these are said to be the channels of the medicine, or the shapes of the songs that the shaman sings, the ikaros. And I've experienced the few times that I've actually had visions of those ikaros was when they were like really out of alignment and really asymmetrical and fucked up. And that brings me back also to like childhood fevers. Whenever I was sick, I would have these recurring visions. One of them was of these hands with these really stringy fingers and arms that were holding like an organ that was too heavy for it, and it made me so nauseous to think of. And another one was of these two limousines, identical limousines, lined up on top of each other. But even though they were identical, they didn't match up. They didn't line up in symmetry. So there's something there about, I think, at the core, sound healing. And, you know, I have a practice of toning. I've done workshops called Becoming of Sound Mind, finding your voice, tuning in, and becoming of sound mind, where people come together and we all like create tone together. And it's like it soothes the nervous system, first of all, but also it's a way of foregoing kind of the gift wrap of language with all its opinions and diversifications, and it was really powerful. The last time we did it, this one guy said, I never understood how a formation of birds without a leader can like flock in unison, but I'm beginning to understand, which was like the most beautiful reflection on that, because it really becomes that you start moving together like that. And I find often, like, if I'm doing this, I do it throughout the day where I just hum. I think it's also like it's an acknowledgement of this cellular unity and like creating harmony within those structures.
Definitely. And I can tell you that humming and just kind of music in general, it does like, it gets into the cells, it gets into the bones, into the nervous system, and you can even destroy different various microbes because, again, different cell membranes are strong to certain things. Like our cells, we can stay in sunlight at least for a certain amount of time, but to a certain microbe, it will get destroyed instantly.
Right.
But that same microbe may be able to tolerate higher temperatures or different wavelengths. At a certain sound frequency, our ears will bleed, but different sound frequencies are going to destroy cells, cancer cells, or microbial cells of various species.
This is what I noticed with the Shipibo as well, and that Paradise Has Parasites piece. I get into a lot of descriptions, which I've never heard anybody do when they're like studying these shamanic traditions, but descriptions of what the shaman is doing with his voice and with his singing and how that registers to me in various metaphoric apprehensions. And maybe my metaphoric apprehensions are wrong, but I feel like I was on the right track. But they would often go from this like to these like these very high-pitched, almost like flower children voices, you know? Like when I think of that, that's probably to target particular microbial, like kind of like microbe whispering, you know? And in the book that I've been reading every morning now called Microbes, An Invisible Universe by Howard Guest or Jest, which is fascinating, he talks about how there are certain microbes that can withstand like very intense conditions, or what happens really is that there's like a mother cell that releases a spore. And so when the microbe itself gets destroyed, the spore is able to withstand like incredible heat or cold and things like that, and then eventually will re-fester its culture.
Yeah.
Which is also so interesting to me, the idea of what we've been talking about lore and folklore and things like that, which is ultimately like culture, right? Is like what we've mined from the realm and stored on our databases. And that culture itself is also the word for, you know, these microbial collectives as they fester and what do you call it? Create chemical reactions. What's the word for it? Ferment, as they ferment.
Ferment, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I like that your lore spores. It captures kind of both elements of that in one nice flowy kind of title. But yeah, when it comes especially to like fungal spores, those things are practically indestructible. And
travel through space, apparently, right? Like panspermia is the idea that they've like traveled through space to, as Terence McKenna put it, like to inoculate the Earth with thought, or maybe those are my words, but that's his sentiment, I think.
Very well could have been. Anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's, especially when it comes to fungus, because they basically terraformed the planet. If you go back far enough, there's no kind of soil or anything, but mycelium is able to break down all this mineral rock, all these metals, and remediate it in a way that's now biologically available. And then you're able to have all this new type of life come in.
Right. I wanted to pull up a couple of quotes from Herrera that might be interesting jump-off points. So this is from Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings. He says, through microbiology, we have come to understand that entities, normally invisible to the naked eye, inhabit the air, the water, and the earth, affecting their properties and dynamics. Moreover, we, like other plants and animals, are ourselves microbiota, complex ecological systems in constant change. We have recognized that we are made of cells, but more importantly, that our mammalian cells are outnumbered by a highly diverse community of microbes, mostly bacteria. They make our bodies operational, foster our development, and mediate our ability to interact with the environment. Another quote here. Microorganisms, mostly bacteria, comprise more than half of the cells in the human body. Furthermore, challenging Western notions of stable personhood and identity defined by the inheritance of DNA, microbes provide for roughly 98% of our working DNA. That's pretty well. I mean, it's like a nice summation of a lot of the things we've just talked about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not an easy book to read, but I didn't finish the whole thing, but it was a couple of years ago. It was around the time that you were broadcasting a lot of findings from it that I was like, this is something I should check out, especially with, he mentioned Leishmania in there as well, briefly at some point. Yeah.
It was interesting that I found that book because I was already on that like idea. I was like, oh, all these cultures with their like, whether it's like witchcraft and using graveyard mold, or whether it's fermentation of beer and they're using like sacred songs to have a wild ferment, or they're using cleansing incense to get rid of bats. They all had this kind of thing. And then that book came to my attention. And that one specifically, he goes into how germ theory ultimately was kind of like pilfered from what these Taino shamans were talking about with syphilis. And so our very concept of like microbiology is pretty much pulled and maybe you could say stolen from the Taino shamanic understanding of what these kind of spirits beings are. Obviously we've distorted it to the point where we just see them as these like kind of bottom feeder tiny beings that don't really do anything or mean anything.
Or we exploit them like we do everything else and like domesticate them for our own purposes. Like, these can be used to make beer, you know, these can be used to make bread. Like this book gets into that a lot too. And it even gets into the microbes book. It gets into bioweapons even, which is just insane, man. That they're like, oh, we can release a little bomb of anthrax in an area and see what it does. Like, this is how humanity largely thinks without these kinds of traditions in place. And I think that that's what ultimately shamanism, it's said, it's not a religion. It's more like it's a series of techniques. And I think it's the closest you come to understanding that world in a practical way, you know? Like, it's been said the shaman is part priest, part artist, part entertainer, part doctor, you know, like part scientist. And it's the combination of all those things. And I think that's where science and even like psychedelic quote unquote science nowadays, or like the speculators in the sidelines, seem to just go with unexamined assumptions that lead to unfounded and ungrounded conclusions, where they're looking at you know, breaching other worlds filled with entities that greet them, but don't try to deconstruct that world to realize that that world exists within the body, within, again, the action figure of who we really are. That, you know, Terence McKenna's idea of self-transforming machine elves, if you strip away the folkloric element, what you're left with sounds to me like molecular structures, or like, what are they called, like motor proteins and things like that, or the I sent you that example video of the Hindu temple structures, which are like a one-to-one correspondence to like these cellular machines, like these pillars of all these different parts, even with this little, like, what would you call that, a wedge or a little rotor thing that's like creating the motor mechanism of it. It's like, that sounds to me like a closer apprehension. Like, if you understand that folklore is an interface through which to understand processes that are accessible and a better acquaintance with the body and its wisdom and intelligence. Because I think ultimately that's the mind is the mentation of the body, and then there's this secondary mind, which is like James's idea of consciousness, which I consider like mind as media, which is, you know, a mediating form of mind that isolates us in this little human world. But when people say like consciousness is the ontological primitive, what I think they don't know they're referring to, but what they're actually referring to is that not that mind precedes matter, but that matter is mind. That it is the matter of the mind, and that thought processes, or unconscious or subconscious thought processes, are processes in the body that then lead to a subconscious level of imagery, and then a conscious level of, you know, descriptability, narratization, spatialization, and communicability. Or something to that effect.
I think what Herrera said in Microbes and Other Shamanic beings. He also said that microbiology does not exhaust all the shamanic understanding of what we call microbiology. I don't know what their terms would have been. Even in our terms of saying spirit is kind of like a bastardization of what they actually believe. But for lack of the right words, like microbiology does not, they knew more than what we know of microbiology now within these traditions, because you can think of it as you can take a microscope and look at the little guys moving around. That is not a good interface for what it's like to be a microorganism, or what it's like to be a microorganism affecting a person, affecting its host organism. And you're only going to get that if you're going like into that world. And you're not going to do that through a microscope. You're going to do that through
the microscope. I think of, if you ever watch I Heart Huckabees, that film, there's a scene in there where, there's like a couple interfacing, and she says there's glass between us, and he has to take his sunglasses off. That's what I think, the microscope. There's glass between us. It's an othering of this thing which is really intrinsic to our own biological makeup and psychophysiological makeup. So we have to find ways to get through the microscope and mingle amongst them. And you speaking of the Hindu temples, you kind of alluded to the Vedas and a kind of microbial interpretation of the Vedas. And you mentioned this after reading a piece of mine, which I might throw up on Patreon, link in show notes, called Paisley Ontology, which kind of gets into my own first development of these ideas, a kind of reframing of McKenna's framework, and an encounter with what I called like fossil records playing back, and like this cellular ancestry interfacing with me. And you mentioned something about the musicality of my language, and how if you read it at face value, it's almost like nonsense. But if you immerse yourself, and again, the sonic entrainment, right, the meter, the kind of lyrical enchantment of it kind of induces you into this thing that it sings its way around the void, it sings its way to isolate, to outwit the impossible and articulate what can't be articulated. And you mentioned like the Vedas have this very similar quality, and how it feels like there are kind of microbial overtures in there.
Yeah. So most like ancient texts and ancient languages, especially the Vedas, they were meant to be sung. They were completely a singing experience. And within that, you naturally get those states of being immersed. It's not because the words themselves are necessarily like translating a meaning of microorganisms or spiritual stuff. But for some reason, when they start to connect through this like circuit of your brain, it's kind of building something greater than, or maybe it's like in between the lines of the words. There's this, it's so hard to define, but when you get immersed in like a poetry or music, you're literally taken on a journey, and your imagination and your whole kind of being is displaced. You're in the realm that media has created. And I think there's always going to be something that touches on the microscopic, at least in terms of like when you're talking about religions or psychedelics and stuff like that. There's always going to be something that is touching on the microscopic within these journeys.
You mentioned the scope of the wars in the Vedas as well. Like,
oh yeah. So they have these huge, insane, divine conflicts, these cosmic struggles. And it's just like, the numbers are ridiculous. The number of years, you have like hundreds of millions of years, hundreds of millions of beings, and all these kind of divine weapons. And I've always thought that viruses were kind of like the siege engines, or the relics, or some kind of tool created by microorganisms, or perhaps by by hosts like cell bodies and stuff. And so they're waging these huge wars, or you might even think of it in like science fiction as like fleet battles. You've got these like endless hordes of kind of drones just being thrown at each other. But the the Vedas and Hindu mythology very much reads like that, especially when you mention the temples, microscopic structures, and having that sense of like, oh yeah, there's these battles that go on, consisting of hundreds of millions of beings all the time, everywhere at once, and this invisible planes. You're describing microorganisms to a T. Right. But I think the important part is that microbiology doesn't understand the full extent of it. It's not just, we're not reducing the kind of mythology. We're saying that, oh yeah, there's a lot more going on in the microscopic world than we're ready to understand.
That's why I think it's important to have figures like yourself who are very like scientifically astute, but also use that just as a jump off point for something, to allow space for mystery, to serve the mystery. And I really appreciate the way that oftentimes in your, I guess we'll call them monologues, soliloquies, video essays, there are these jump-off points where, much like myself, you'll just veer off into a kind of like poetic musing off of it, where it's no longer like a one-to-one like scientific argument, but it's like it takes it into this realm where it's almost, it takes time to be able to process the whole thing, which that kind of dark matter of it kind of creates space for mystery to overtake understanding, to realize that the understanding is not, it's just like some dirt on the window that you can still like, and the dirt, of course, again, is like bacterial and microbial.
Right. Always full circle.
One more thing to like backtrack earlier to the idea of the shaman like extracting sickness in order to study it in their body. There's a lot of documentation about Amazonian shamanism and the idea of these magic phlegm or these darts, which oftentimes are used in like shamanic warfare between like feuding shamans and things like that, which is a kind of like proto-biological warfare, I think. And the notion that the shaman has basically like two darts in him, and one is poison and one is medicine. And of course, like medicine in small doses is kind of antidote, right? So I thought that was an interesting little parallel to that illustration.
That is really interesting. And that's reminding me what we're doing today with trying to kind of play God with the microbes, which in my opinion are pretty much the gods, at least in terms of anything we can kind of come to the conclusion of. But we're trying to like create certain strains. We're trying to genetically modify them. We're trying to, or like biological warfare. And this is not going to end well because you don't know how they're going to retaliate. You don't know how they're going to change themselves. And because especially when you get into shamanism, they get the understanding that the land is paying attention to everything you're doing. The land knows what's going on. And as you continue to abuse it, you're eventually it's going to stop you from doing that. It's almost like a nervous system or immune system, but I think it's very conscious. It's very aware because they're the things that make us who we are anyways. And if we consider ourselves aware, we owe that credit to the thing that makes us who we are, which is not us. Ultimately.
Well, that's why leishmania is basically unleashed a lot in the Yucatan, where I contracted it, is because they've been deforesting the area in an effort to build Tren Maya, a railroad across the Yucatan. And nature doesn't put up signs that say, don't do this or this. It has subliminal signs that say, fuck around and find out. And then if you're chopping too deep into the forest, it's going to unleash these ancient forces like Evil Dead, like an evil force has awakened, and then it's going to find its hosts and its vectors in cats and dogs, and its vectors in female sandflies, and then eventually it'll find somebody like myself, a bardo bard, a folklore axe, in order to tell its tale, So it picked a good candidate, and I'm grateful for everything. It's the initiations that it's given me, both shamanic, biological, and ecological. So, but that's exactly what happens, is that the land, just like the nervous system, has built-in defense systems and immune systems. And fuck around and find out, humanity.
And but it's also the cool thing about like that sort of cosmic power struggle in various mythologies that also resemble kind of how the microbial world interacts is it's this huge romance of different teams, different factions, and they're constantly competing and getting the advantage. And like when we made super bugs, when we make super bacteria, when we overprescribe antibacterials and antibodies and stuff, and those bacteria survive, they become super resilient to that kind of antibody. But if you were to put that bacteria back in nature, it's going to get absolutely destroyed by everything around it because it very specifically got strong against this one counter. But there's so many other things that can counter what it isn't prepared for.
It's kind of like somebody that's very adept at judo being put into an MMA fight or something.
Yeah, you may be the best judo person, but if you're not ready to fight that.
Yeah, interesting. I just had a thought. Like, let's. This is taking a page from my friend Ramin's podcast. Let's take 10 seconds of silence. I'm just going to play my Sensula for a second, just to kind of like check in with ourselves and reset and see what surfaces. All right. I don't know if any thoughts surfaced in the midst of that enchanted.
It was very relaxing.
Yeah, I think it's important when we're delving into so many interesting terrains to take a breath sometimes to like recalibrate, you know?
Yeah.
I like how Jason Horsley, who is a very interesting thinker, on his podcast, he'll like cut it up and put little musical interludes in between, which when he had me on, he used some of my songs from my old band Theatera, which I was really quite pleased by because they were almost like, I call them distillustrations. They would distill and illustrate the things we were talking about in little pithy little story songs, which allowed, like the mind a moment of reprieve and play, which is, always a good thing.
Yeah, that is always a good thing. It is very easy to get caught up and yeah.
Let me see here if I've got some other good topics, unless you have something that jumps to mind. This is maybe an interesting one because the reason that I reached out to you recently was because both your TikTok, which has quite a substantial following, and your Instagram channels both got rebooted to nothing. Like you had like two posts up on there. Because I was looking for a specific post because you don't just give these kind of like poetic lectures on these subjects. You also give like very concrete advice at times. And there was one about how to remedy headaches and migraines. And I was looking for that video that I wanted to send to a few friends. And then I noticed you weren't active on there, or they had taken down your inventory, or they had, I guess if your posts are microbial, they had like antimicrobial agents algorithmatized onto there. Luckily, the TikTok is back up and running.
Yeah.
But there was a post a long time ago on your Instagram that I really loved where you talked about Aleister Crowley and this idea of summoning spirits or almost like domesticating spirits and things like that. And again, you brought it back down to a kind of alliance or enchantment over parasites, for instance. The idea that a lot of the lore around witchcraft and wizardry has to do with fortune and health, in the sense that, again, like the shamans and their darts, like this kind of flinging disease at another. And being from the Netherlands, on the playground, we don't cuss with bodily functions and body parts like they do here. We don't call you an asshole or a motherfucker or something like that. We fling antiquated diseases at one another, and we say, Gunkerlayer, we call you sufferer of cancer, or we say, go and obtain cholera and typhus and things like that. Like, it's really fucking nasty. So we're literally just like flinging verbal disease at one another. But yeah, the Crowley thing I thought was really interesting because, again, it just brings things down to a grounded and tethered perspective. Maybe you can muse on that.
Yeah. Who was it? There was a Greek, I think, doctor or physician from way back in the day. It might have been, I don't know. But he basically said that all diseases are divine. And that definitely sounds something that tracked back to a much older idea that probably persisted through it.
In Amazonian shamanism too, like disease is kind of your teacher, you know? You sit at its lotus feet and you learn about the dysregulations in the body that caused these things.
Yeah, and I think that's why fever is important. Not that you should just try to power through every single infection. You certainly can try to if you want, but when we completely get rid of that step, we don't ever really clear the infection properly, because especially when it comes to infections, diseases are very good at hiding in your lymphatic system or in different areas. And when you try to just knock it out with antibodies, it's smart. It knows that. It's going to dig in deep. And then that's why the year later or the next year, you're going to get that same infection again, because you never actually cleared it. Your body never learned what was going on, what lessons it needed to be learned. But then you have people who seek out infections. And these are people like Crowley who they kind of considered it a badge of honor to get infections and to spread like STIs specifically, which is, but they did
on
that because
yes, on the house.
I guess to some extent they understood that if you keep overloading yourself with these divine sort of godly beings or demons, maybe whatever you want to kind of call them, depending on the context, you can get a lot of like insights and knowledge. I think the fallacies, the hubris that you're really going to be the one controlling them, or they're going to start to control you and they're going to propagate and spread, especially if it's something that is a lot of parasites. They do manipulate your nervous system. They do manipulate your biochemistry into wanting to do stuff that will spread it ultimately.
Yeah, I think of malaria, for instance. I learned that when a mosquito infected with malaria infects you, your entire body chemistry alters in a way where it excretes particular scents that attract more mosquitoes to then take a little sip of malaria until it goes viral, you know, until everybody's pressing that repost button.
And what's interesting about mosquitoes that carry malaria is that they can only carry malaria if they have a different fungus that allows them to be a carrier that kind of changes their immune system, that then makes them. So these microbes, it's like nesting dolls. There's always something playing against someone else for a different reason. And
it's interesting. Yeah, first of all, I want to comment that you're so much more jovial in person than you are in your videos. In your videos, you have a very serious, stern quality and these kind of your searing eyes, and I can tell there's like a fire burning inside you. You call it a ghost light or a kind of flameless fire, which is also a description made for the jinn, right? The Arabic jinn, that they have they are made of a smokeless fire. But there was one particular video, and I'm thinking of maybe working it into the sound into the introduction, where you talk about weaponizing your skills, which I found really powerful. And there's kind of like a revolutionary edge to what you're doing. There's a video you talk about you built an archangel when you were a child, and you basically describe how you learned about myths and about science and about all these different things we've been talking about in an effort to, you know, with the vow to tear down civilization. You even say like you marked your skin with a or you branded it with a scar to remind you of this vow that, oh wow, that's not a joke, man. That's like a
It's
hoof
actually
hoof
two, but
shaped.
you can only really see that one. But there is a second one here. But
Holy shit. Yeah, that's hardcore. But you say something, there was a very beautiful poetic notion, like something about building a forest of thought, but you're not afraid to burn it down if it means that we can be free from tyranny. And I feel like there's something so potent in that, because again, it takes it from just like knowledge-based to like a kind of activism, and the way that you're casting your spells on the web and disseminating the spores of your learnings. It's kind of like, it's like building an army to like take people's heads out of the clouds and out of the dissociated phosphine phantom realms and back towards the kind of the primordial ink blot of what generates it, the amoeba as ink blot, you know, in order to better serve those things. Because like we're saying, like we're even exploiting microbes towards our own uses through biological warfare or fermentation and things like that. Some of them are like, that's a good symbiotic relationship. It's like, here, we'll give you sugar, you thrive, we get drunk, like,
yeah.
But maybe you can speak towards the weaponization of skill, because I think that's something very beautiful. It reminds me a little bit of Jordan Peterson too, who, it's kind of like funny to bring him up nowadays, but he talks a lot about like, if you know how to write and if you know how to speak and be articulate, then you are dangerous, man.
Oh God, Jordan Peterson. Yeah, I'm definitely, my content is definitely meant to be very revolutionary, whether it's people's like personal lives in just kind of like taking back what's kind of happened to them, especially like we have all these medical industries that don't understand anything to do with microorganisms or the nervous system, or the food industries and what they do to farming practices and animal practices, and all the bullshit that goes on in the world. And people either want to just anesthetize themselves, escape everything, just find their little cozy corner of the planet and live out their days, or they're just going to join the wave that kind of seems to be growing bigger and bigger. And I think that neither of those options are acceptable, because you kind of have to fight, I think, because especially with this sort of like cosmic power struggle, not that I think that it's I'm losing my words a bit.
Just a hierarchical power pyramid, let's say, power from the top down rather than from the bottom up. What
right.
what would activism look like to you ideally? Like, would it be people coming together with picket signs and chanting in unison, which I think if the right chants come about, again, that entrainment and that kind of like thing. But I feel like those things are more, I think maybe it's important to do that because a lot of changes have been made in society through people coming together and protesting. But at the same time, I think there's a kind of like self-congratulatory or virtue signaling kind of like self-satisfaction with having done it. What would ideally activism look like in the sense of weaponizing skills in these realms?
Personally, I think you should tear it all down and just start something new.
That's the way they do it at Burning Man, end of the week,
yeah,
burn it down.
really?
The first time I went, I came back and I was like, I ended up in Reno for a few days, and I was like, Reno is what happens when you don't burn it down at the end of the week and you let it fester, and like that's so much of civilization is that we build it out of such solid materials that it's harder to, it becomes very much calcified, and ossified, that we can't as easily tear a system down because it's so self-enforced.
Yeah. But I think at the very least, if people, they're able to start healing outside of this like medical industry or pharmaceutical industry, they're able to start learning how to work with the land so that they can grow their own food successfully. Because a lot of people are very afraid that they're not going to have the skills that, oh, I don't have any of the, I didn't learn the traditional knowledge of how to do this over the course of thousands of years of my ancestors. But I also wanted to show that you can rediscover any of those things. The land and your nervous system has the memory of all these processes. I also want people to take a look at whatever the culture they have. I try not to like encroach too much upon like these like sacred cultures and their traditions, but I do try to get enough in there to say that, hey, if you're from this culture, you should take another look at it and you should kind of revive it, maybe in a modern way that allows you to work with how reality is right now. But all those kinds of things, I think, would be very revolutionary and on a mass scale.
It's kind of the curse of specialization, isn't it? That we become so specialized in a particular field that we outsource all the other stuff, the important stuff, to other people, like agriculture and stuff like that, you know, like being able to grow your own food or make your own medicine and all that kind of thing. Like, I lived in North Carolina for a few years, and I noticed people there are much more into like rewilding and wild tending and community and farming and herbology and kind of like the folk arts of knowing the land on which you live. And I think, to bring it back to the idea of myth analoging particular terrains or particular grounded knowledge, as we became more diasporic and nomadic, I think the myths carried along but no longer analoged the land from which they came. So it's like the Aboriginals have their song lines, you know, on the dreaming land. There's these song lines that, as you walk the path, you sing, you know, like there by the billabong tree, there's a and the river on the right, and you know, you kind of like sing your way through, and those are songs that the ancestors sang, but they said the land sang it to them. And then as the modern Aboriginals will sing those songs, it's the ancestors singing through them and the land singing through the ancestors. Peter Gabriel has a great song that has a line in there, I sing through the land sings through me, which always makes me think of that. But there's the story of an Aboriginal who is giving a modern man a tour of the land, riding passenger side of his Jeep, but he can't sing fast enough, you know, because the pace it's a walking pace. And I think it's also the kind of when I think of time travel, like you go back in time, you know, you go to like the 1500s and you can tell them, you're like, well, in the future where I come from, we have electric lights. And they're like, wow, really? How does it work? And you're like, I don't know.
Yeah,
you know, like we want to take credit for the inventions of the species, but it's like, look at what we're using right now, the liquid crystal display and the ability to see each other across time and space, where you, I think, have hummingbirds buzzing outside your window from what I heard. Yeah. And I've got car horns honking, and somehow we're able to like interface like this and record it. It's like, I don't know how it works. I can't tell you. But when it comes to the basic things, I think somebody like yourself and myself and even Julian Jaynes is like this too. They're not specialists. He was like a Princeton psychology professor, but if you read his book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, it goes in he pulls from all these different sources, from like archaeology and anthropology and all these different things. One more thought, and then I'll pass it over to you. Thinking about revolution and biological warfare and articulation, William Burroughs talks about language. He said, language is a virus from outer space. I think it's a virus from inner space, but it is viral, and it does have the ability to propagate ideas if you can articulate them. And like my mode of operation is where the limits of language meet the fringes of reality. I try to push language to its limits to see how it's going to behave when it's pushed upon unspeakable terrains, and oftentimes it will speak in multiple entendres, or it'll start behaving kind of like the elves that McKenna describes, you know, like doing backflips. It starts flapping its wings to see if it can fly. It starts contorting itself in different ways, and then new languages open up vistas into new realities, and new realities in turn prompt new languages. So I think that, in a way, that is kind of my contribution, my virality or bio weapon artistry,
Right.
in that sense.
Your handle of the language is so good. And when I was listening to Paradise as Parasites the other night, again, I was kind of like half asleep because I like to be almost in that like haze, like kind of delirium haze when I listen to stuff that's meant to be more psychedelic, because I don't do psychedelics, but I still like to be in those kind of altered states. And so when I hear it and I'm listening to words, it's like every couple words or every sentence has so much packed into it. At least for me, it's not overwhelming, but it's definitely like it's a lot to listen to, because I know the effort you put into these connections and words, these similes and metaphors and rhymes and whatever the other terms of language are. But you have all of this kind of playfulness in the words that really do take you on that journey, that make you feel like you're there. But it's also, and I think this has to do with just how we process information, especially with language, because language is so seeped into so many different neural circuits. When we are immersed into that storytelling, that information is like bouncing around to all these different senses. So you're getting not just the experience of what this person's saying, it's connecting to all your different experiences, all your memories, as in all my memories, all my experiences. It's hitting all these different aspects of the brain. And so that's something that's interesting with language. If you're trying to like kind of weaponize it or use it in ways to convince people, which is kind of what advertising does, is it's trying to subliminally get you on board for all of this. But you can also take that same ability.
Black magic, advertising is pure black magic. It's literally weaponizing that against us in order to get us things we don't need, to stuff the void.
And it works, and it works. So, which also means that it would work for us too if we try to use language in a way to make things better.
Right. I mean, I unfortunately, I used to think that I was kind of like Mickey Mouse quality, that I was for everyone, but I'm starting to understand that, I'm far more niche than I would like to admit. But indeed, it's like I try to be very precise and try to articulate very complex things in interesting and evocative ways, and in a way where it's also the quality of the sound, that even if you don't understand all the words, it's still pleasant to listen to the musicality, and the connectivity is mirrored in the way I use the language through the alliteration and the meter and these kinds of things. And I think you do that as well to a degree. You have like a very pleasant voice to listen to. Like while I was listening to a lot of your essays in preparation of this, a lot of times I would just close my eyes and I would just like let the train of thought kind of drift along in that way, And it's what I think I do as well, is I'm not trying to talk about the thing so much as I'm trying to demonstrate the thing in the medium that I'm using. And that's not the mode that everybody is, because it is psychoactive listening experience, and that's not for everybody. It's not like something you put on in the background. It's like something you have to like dream into. And like you said, like if you immerse yourself in the language, like something comes alive. I cast a spell on myself many years ago, about like 24 years ago. I started writing. I had finished writing a novel when I was 19, and then I decided, that took me a year. I learned a lot. Let me do the next one, And that's something that still continues on. Like I'm composting things from that. But the story was about basically a writer who is seeking to destroy language by using language. And this comes down to the idea of what is known as a lethal text, which is a text that when you read it, it makes full sense. It's fully immersive. But when you come out of it, you can't really relay what was in there. And good examples of this, for instance, is like the siren song from the Odyssey. The siren, anybody who hears it is fully enraptured by it, but you can't make it out alive, and if you do, it will destroy your mind. So it's like, in setting out to write this story, what I learned along the way is that I became the subject of that. It was like this mirror psychology happening, through which my language evolved in a way where it became less domesticated, because we domesticate our language, we take it for walks, we talk shit, we take a piss, like we mark our territory with it, we bark, like all these animalistic qualities are there. But when you set it free and learn to be able to let it follow its own logic on its own accordance, but then be able to like whistle and call it back in, there's something very vital that happens. But I feel like that your work is also kind of like a lethal text. Like there are things that they might be able to take out of it, but there's also a kind of a nebulousness to it where while you're in it, you can immerse yourself in it without fully understanding the full scope of it, that you might not be able to relay it, but you can revisit as more information comes along, through which you can pull into focus those other dark areas.
Yeah, it's like what you say, lore spores. It's planting something that, if they choose to cultivate, can grow into something of their own, because it's not like trying to tell someone, oh, this is how it has to be, this is the way it is, you need to learn this is the divine word that I'm giving you. I'm going to try to put you in a state of mind that activates all these regions so that you can see these things for yourself in your own way that works for you in your environment, your personhood, in your culture, which is, again, means that you're going to limit your audience of who's going to be interested enough to actually spend the time to
the more
hours and hours of content it takes to do this.
The more you put in there of yourself, the more you're going to get out of it, essentially. Right? Yeah. That's why I appreciated you reading Lore Spores, and the feedback you gave me was like, I felt very seen, where you're like, it's deceptively dense, it's a much bigger book than it seems. And like I said, a lot of people see it and at first glance, they think it's a children's book because of the artwork in it. But then I'm using the artwork to illustrate some very interesting and dense ideas that in the future volumes are going to, continue to unfold and go into wilder territory, until the idea is that the last volume is basically the material of that book, which is going to be, the volume's going to be called Inwards Onwards. Inwards Onwards.
Nice. Are you even that aware of when you're putting these word plays together, or does it take a lot of effort, or is it kind of like naturally it's just like a rhythm that you get into?
It's kind of where language has a life of its own, and I serve the lore in the sense that I serve it like on a plate, and I serve it as in like at its service. Sometimes things come through and it's somebody else will point out. I remember when I first wrote, I think I sent you that little intro invocation from Paisley Ontology, right? And there's a line in there that was also in something else. It was actually when I let somebody read something else, it says, and now our feature presentation. And I was thinking just in cinematic terms, but then somebody was like, that's so clever, the feature presentation, like our evolutionary features. And I was like, yep. But, so I like that I've trusted my channel enough where I can let the medium get ahead of its message, or let the message ahead of its medium or something, where I sometimes have to catch up with what comes through. And that, again, it's like, and this is where we can get into demonic territory, is that when you suspend the sense of egoic control and allow the channel to kind of like let things come through from elsewhere, that's why I consider the pareidolik art form, which in Lore Spores I also have like exercises for people to like get hands-on with it to understand what I'm talking about firsthand.
Right.
That there's this, I lost my train of thought there. Look at that. It'll come back. Come back, train of thought.
Train has left the station.
Train's left the station. All right, well, maybe it'll come back in a moment. It completely went out the window. That's amazing.
Yeah, that happens to me even while I'm speaking too. So,
yeah.
But there was actually something in Lore Spores you said. I think it was one of the first pages was the ability of your imagination to be so strong that you can eat like plane components because you've
Right. Yeah, that's Pika, right? It's this disorder where this guy literally ate a Cessna plane.
Yeah.
But it's taking it literally, you know? It's like he's literally eating the plane, and that's like taking your imagination literally instead of just seriously. Because we used to, I think I described it as like when we were children, we would only eat things if they were offered to us in the form of a plane or a train that goes into the tunnel of your mouth. But then this guy grew up and actually ate a plane, you know? It's like, all right, let's take a step back there.
Yeah.
I remember now where I was going with it, which is the channeling, quote unquote, of these forms, letting it come from this deeper place. And not, you know, we think of channeling as like coming from some other place, but I think it's just opening up the floodgates to this higher knowing, this like, I like the word entelechy, which is kind of like the realized potential, the whole, with a W, the whole, which is I talk about pareidolia as a daemonic interface, and the daemon of the Greeks is the genius of the Romans, which is often also thought of as like a spirit, which again like others this aspect of the self with a capital S. And so for me, the daemonic is that the unconscious in the sense of this, you know, psychophysiology, and allowing that to, you know, express itself freely. So I would get out of the way, quote unquote, analog metaphor me, would get out of the way and allow this sort of thing to come through. And you wrote about daemons as well in very interesting ways, where you pointed out that it's also a computational term of a kind of background program that's running. Maybe you can talk about that, because I like, again, how you took this kind of, these archetypal notions and, again, like rooted them in the body as these kind of like background programs, and allowing those to take the wheel at times.
Yeah. So if you want to think about your pareidolia brain as being almost a discrete entity or structure, depending on how you want to imagine it, as like a more living thing or as a more like architectural thing, but basically it's kind of its own thing now, and it's working in your subconscious. So it is that kind of like background process, but it's also kind of that like spirit being that's sort of an intermediary between things, in this case your mind and what you're perceiving. And so you do kind of interface with it. You can consciously, well, you can also consciously turn it off and be like, okay, I don't want to see faces and everything right now. But you can also be like, I want to see a face in something, and you can sort of set that program to be running in the background. And that's where they're most effective. Your subconscious is so much stronger than your conscious. It takes a lot of effort to like manually process information. But if you're just like working on a problem, and you know you have a really good problem solving sort of like neural connection, you can set that up in the background, do other stuff, trust that that information is getting processed by that like discrete entity within you, that discrete structure. And that's kind of like the idea of kind of utilizing these daimons. And my pronunciation is a little different because I think it's from the Latin, maybe. So that's where I first heard it.
So there's the DAEMON, and then there's the DAIMON, but it's the same root. And I know that the DAIMON has its etymology based in a word that means divider, or to divide. So it has, again, to do with kind of like the fragmentation of the psyche. So splintering off into these different parts and then letting these parts work for you, kind of like Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of thing, with the little, you know, letting the brooms do the water hauling. But, you know, you got to be careful too when summoning daemons to not, you know, you have to learn first to trust these, set the configurations that you can trust, so that you understand your intentions, you know what I mean? Again, like
right.
Russian nesting doll kind of thing.
Exactly. And how much of that is influenced by parts of you that are maybe traumatized or parasitized, and or have been conditioned in society, has been kind of like advertised into your mind subliminally. Like how being aware of like intrusive thoughts or something is kind of like a background process that's become viral. It's become something invasive. And so that's something that like, but you can understand that you can actually get rid of that, and you can kind of prune back those connections by stop feeding them, because they get stronger and stronger the more you listen to them, the more you use them.
Right. To go back to the Paradise as Parasites, Colonel Carapas, as I called him, the parasite. I never was sure if this was an actual like intestinal parasite or if this was just like a parasitic thought form. But when I think back at the way that it presented itself, first of all, like giving me the production design to realize it as like a film prop, or the way that it walked down the red carpet in front of the paparazzi and really relished in that attention. This was like before I decided I was finally going to move to LA to pursue a career as an actor there. And I think it had a lot to do with kind of the vanquishing of those egoic aspirations and the kind of the parasite of the programming of desiring fame or things like that, and bring it back to kind of like the shamanic ideal of like wanting to take people on vicarious journeys into the underworld and into the depths in that regard, right?
Take them to the abyss. But that's the thing, is so ambiguous, is that it could have been a parasite, and that parasite could have been tied to that thought form.
Exactly.
And I think that ambiguity is why you have mythology and storytelling. It's so, you need it, because it's what is going on. And I don't think you're ever going to fully know, because even if you did figure it out, there would be something new that came up. There'd be new territory that maybe just spawned in, I don't know, or maybe that just you get discovered when you push those limits of reality. There's going to be something new. So even if we defined all of the spirit realm or all of the microbial realm, there's going to be something new beyond that. You're never going to.
The map will never match the territory. But I think that is part of the human ambition, in a way, is to have the map overtake the territory, which is why we're in the dilemma that we're in, that we're just like so stuck in it, because experience outgrows our understanding, and understanding and knowing is always going to be an othering of the self. It's again this unintegrated apprehension that, and I talk about this in lore sports too, that it's more important to go into something not knowing and figuring it out, which is that sense of openness where you have to make sense of the world and be vulnerable and take new information as it comes in order to assimilate. And otherwise, if you take the software metaphor, if you don't upgrade it, it's just going to become obsolete. It's just going to break down the hardware.
I think that's the inherent flaw in written language, is that you've petrified this idea, this neural connection, and you think that, that's always going to apply indefinitely forever. This is like the sacred rule that's always going to be relevant. But when we talk about how nature has these like nesting dolls, how there's this power struggle between different things, the dynamics always changing. The who's on top is always shifting, which is why I like the Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, because it's this story that you have these different warring kingdoms and they're changing faction allegiances. There's betrayal, there's intrigue. And so all these kind of things are happening in nature everywhere, where you have kind of different factions and they're fighting and warring. But those conflicts and struggles are part of like what it means to be alive.
Well, they're upgrades. They're reality negotiations, I think. Like in that case, it might be over territory, but it's the same if you're in a domestic argument or something like that. It's again Jordan Peterson. It's actually good, to go in an argument with your spouse, because it becomes reality negotiations. We're coming from completely different backgrounds, different ontological frameworks, and we have to sometimes spar to like find the weaknesses and see how we can create like symbiotic equilibrium with self and other in that regard.
The same reason with your immune system is the more you need to be outside and exposed to microbes to train your immune system and to diversify it. And if you live in a bubble, you don't get that. You get allergic to everything. Everything harms you. You you anesthetize yourself rather than kind of open that synesthesia of feeling.
Yeah, the spell of the sensuous that calls us
Yeah.
back into the sensual world, the tangible world that we literally lose touch with the more we dissociate into the tower of mind. I'm working now with Terence McKenna's daughter, who is working on a podcast where she's like archiving a lot of materials that her father never put out, including like old letters and like correspondences and journal entries. And I'm providing, as the world's foremost Terence McKenna impersonator, I'm providing his voice for these things, which is a really interesting process of kind of raising the dead for a living, but also having his living kin kind of like make adjustments and like, I don't think he'd say this like that, or like try to find, really interesting. And I just recorded one that's an old journal entry where he first starts, I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but where he first starts kind of philosophizing about glossolalia and what it could mean and why it's so pleasurable to just like let language loose, for, as he called it, pure linguistic intent. And he starts kind of contemplating on it, and he draws the connection to how it's well documented in shamanic cultures, how chants and spells entrain the body, and if that's and about why it's so pleasurable and like profound while he's doing it while stoned on psilocybin, and how when he listens back to the recordings it feels very like trivial almost. He's like, well, if I could have brought it back the way that it came across, then it would have changed the world as we know it, but that hope goes out the window basically. And he says that maybe it is like more a matter of psychobiology or psychophysiology than psychology. And that brings me to the idea of daemons and genius. This guy, Giorgio Agamben, who is an Italian philosopher, he has an incredible essay called Genius, or On Genius, that I've drawn a lot from in a piece that I wrote in trying to like reconcile with my own like sense of channeling and daemonic apprehensions. And he again like brings it to this very grounded level where he says that the genius is the impersonal in you, which is to say it is your psychophysiology. It's like the part that causes your heart to beat, your respiration, your digestion, all this kind of stuff. Like without it, you're not even be able to do basic tasks. So I love his essay on that. It's
actually what's interesting about that, to kind of bring it full circle, is when you had those people who learned how to absolutely master their nervous system, they were also taking over control of those subconscious actions where you can control your heart rate now, you can control your digestion, because you've basically entered into that entoptic landscape, and you've kind of like calibrated things to the way you need to do it. Or it might be like in phones they have like this thing called jailbreaking, where you get rid of the manufacturer's default settings so you can use whatever apps you want or whatever. You can mess with the UI and stuff like that. So it's kind of like that. You're glitching yourself out so that you can kind of like, hey, this is what I need to be done because of environmental pressures, or because I need to find this information, or I need this kind of whatever ability or insight.
Like the deconstructing of cultural conditioning in order to re-educate yourself to be in alignment. Let's take another 10 seconds on the Sansula, and then I think we'll go over to the Patreon exclusive thing, which doesn't change anything for the way we talk. It's just making a little marker for myself to spring up a paywall for the people if they're curious for more.
All right, folks, that covers the free portion of the show. Now hop on over to Patreon for the Aftermyth. We have another hour of conversation for you in which we cover some pretty trippy terrains, including I talk about a few psychedelic experiences, and we segue from there into talking about the flower of life and the entoptic implications of that sacred geometry. So do not miss out. And of course, check out the show notes. Lots of things to click and check out. Make sure you go to YouTube and follow Fishing in Space. That is all one word, no spaces, except the word space. Fishing in Space. And Fishing in Space also has an offering for you that he's going to tell you about right now.
I have 3 digital magazines, ebooks, whatever you want to call it, released so far that you can read and download. You can find them in my links in my profile. It's called Exoterica, and the first one's The Red Queen. It's about the Red Queen theory. It's about microorganisms in context of this storytelling tradition, in context of systems at different levels of integration of components, right, of individuals that make up communities, that make up countries, that make up ideologies, and the microorganisms, these beings within that influence that. It's also about prophets, it's about neurology, it's about instinct, and there's also short stories and horror stories in it. The second one is more mystical and more story or narrative driven. It's about the origin of fire-wielding humans. It's about the nature of light. It's about the sun. It's about dragons and black mold and dark matter and melanin. And all of these themes kind of like weave in and out of each other in this magazine. The third one, Puzzle Planet, which came out, I released it a couple months ago, I think. But this one is more individually, more grounded, more personable. It's about you, your skills, your talents, your way of navigating, your way of being part of the storytelling tradition, your way of finding hidden things in reality, your relationship to different factions, different layers of organisms, of different beings. It's inspired from a lot of very ancient ideas as well as retro science fiction and old school fantasy and the digital age, as well as hunting cultures, and sort of blending all of those themes together. And I also have hundreds of videos on YouTube going into a lot of these same topics, a lot of things on microorganisms and mysticism, haunted and horror-based themes, dreams, and various phenomena. So I hope that there's a lot to explore. The nature of it is very random, right? The whole theme of my channel is you never know where you're going to reel in. It's kind of just anything, really.